Wonderful. So it's a great pleasure to have you here, and so we all received your extended bio. So we all know you very well. So it's really a great pleasure to have you and be part of this seminar. So I'm like everyone on this call. I mean, I'm very looking forward to your redefinition of globalization. So. So the floor is yours. If you can share your screen. I mean, I don't know.
Well, first of all, thank you. And thank you, Terry, for organizing this. And thank you all my dear, dear, dear friends that we've all known each other for so many years and shared so many wonderful adventures. So it's a little bit odd doing this on Zoom, but a great pleasure despite all to see you. Okay, the topic that I'd like to talk to you today about, and I certainly hope we have some questions or some issues that you have with it, is what I call redefining globalization, post-pandemic realignments, and new paradigms. The first thing we have to mention is, very sadly, that when we talk about post-pandemic, we had hoped that it would be closer to reality rather than still within the range of possibilities, but nowhere close. However, the issue of how do we define globalization within this framework, within the paradigm that we have all been living with now, is still, I think, a crucial topic to think about. The topic came to me, interestingly enough, because in 2004, I published an article in the Global Economy Journal called Anti-Globalization and EU Enlargement. Why? Because, interestingly enough, the problem of globalization, its definition, and the counterpoint and the large counter demonstrations of anti-globalization were absolutely relevant at that time. Why was that the case? Because starting in, even before certainly the 1990s, but certainly in 2001, when the WTO came fully into being, and provoked, in fact, huge counter demonstrations against what was seen as an Americanization, not so much a globalization, but an overall American imposed harmonization of global criteria, standards, and geostrategic goals. In Seattle, in Genoa, there were huge revolts against it. There were massive demonstrations. What else happened in 2001? 2001 is 9/11. 9/11, which basically, in a sense, broke a veneer, what we know now, of apparent order or stability within the broader cultural and geostrategic and geopolitical set of norms, and created, in many ways, part of the framework and the problems that we're still dealing with. Also, interestingly enough, in 2001, that same year, the BRICS were set out. The BRICS by Jim O'Neill was a term that was coined by a banker at Goldman Sachs, which was supposed to bring together what were then seen as the big emerging markets into this one larger sort of set of countries, which were in fact supposed to be Brazil, Russia, India. Excuse me for a moment, my computer does something weird every once in a while. Okay, great. Which was Brazil, Russia, India, China, and then very quickly linking further down, Turkey and South Africa. What was the goal? The assumption, and it was very much an assumption, was that these countries progressing in the post-Soviet world, progressing in this new geopolitical environment and a very optimistic environment coming out of the 1990s, were going to, in a sense, develop in sync, thought a number of things. One was on the trade level. The other one was on the monetary level. The other one was, however, more profoundly, on the democratization of norms, governance, and forms of governments. This was sort of the goal, and the goal was that they would work in sync toward becoming huge export markets, and in turn, huge markets for the mature economies. This wasn't entirely wrong, but it was very short-lived. Because as we saw by even 2008, 2009, each of these countries had taken an entirely different trajectory and had taken an entirely different set of goalposts that they wanted to meet that did not fit into a specific pattern that was in reality, again, set by the US and the EU at that time. So today, we have a completely different definition when we talk about globalization. This is no longer purely globalization according to Americanization of global standards and criteria, but rather what we could consider much more a tripartite, a tripolar in a way, definition. And what I mean by that is, yes, the US definition, which is clearly now in full transition, will have to be carefully redefined, and I'll talk about that. We then have the European definition, which already early on by 2004 was starting to take on a different dimension when the French, in fact, coined a very charming phrase, which is versus globalization, but mondialisation. So there was that distinction between a purely set of economic criteria and determinants versus bringing in a much more, in a sense, human dimension, a much more, they called moral dimension, more or humanistic dimension, which also included the rights and the decision-making process of citizens and the protection offered to citizens across this overall harmonization. But we now have a third pillar, and a pillar that didn't even exist till basically 2008 to 2000, particularly 2010 on, which is the Chinese definition. And the Chinese themselves have very much clarified and brought out the phrase of globalization with Chinese characteristics. So these are in reality what should be a convergence of goals, but in reality are in many ways a broad divergence. In some ways, the tragedy of this divergence has come out during this pandemic, because at the time where we most of all needed full transparency, cooperation, cohesion in the sense of what we were trying to achieve in front of this unheard of tragedy, this was not the case. And as we know, the pandemic hit as we were in full so-called trade wars, which is a rather odd term, but in some ways relevant, between the US and China, when we were in a situation where the EU was reassuming a much more prominent position versus some of the demands, particularly the tariff demands coming out of the US, and where certainly China was continuing to set its own standards. And in fact, while it was tremendously increasing its economic potential and economic growth, it was in fact insulating itself and locking inward in terms of its own cultural goals, in terms of its own political goals. So you had a very difficult point, which we could have begun to resolve, and then the pandemic hit, and now we know in a way the worst of it rather than the best of it. Okay, what I want to do quickly is I want to look a little bit at the history and why it was important. We have to remember when we talk about the American model in the 1990s, from the end of the Soviet Union, going on through 2004, although yes, there was certainly this broad sense that bringing that type of set of criteria, an American-imposed, totally market-driven ideology, had a lot of negatives. It particularly had negatives on the social side. It immediately brought out, and this goes all the way back to the NAFTA agreements, to the GATT agreements, the problem of whether these huge regional movements and certainly regional trade accords in any way took into account sufficiently workers' rights, wage disparity, much more global inequalities, whether in the process of seeming to make matters more, or corporations or countries more profitable and to increase their rate of progress, but was it in fact creating a much larger segment of marginalized or disenfranchised groups within each society? These factors were out there. In fact, these were factors that Robert Reich and the Clinton administration brought out. And certainly Joseph Stiglitz, who's now with us at Columbia, has brought this out for years In a sense, this was always the message that was the anti-NAFTA message, 1994, the anti-GATT message, certainly the very strong anti-TPP message. And in many ways, this is the message now, which is in a sense confused. Because what we now have is we have anti-globalization factions coming out of the right in the name of sovereignty and autonomy, which in a way is at the heart and soul of why Brexit occurred. And we have the continuation of the left looking at, from the workers' perspective, more from the genuine socialist parties, not the bizarre mythology that the US puts out there, but the genuine, the socialist parties across specifically Europe, the workers' parties, younger people. Anti-globalization movements today are also associated in a complex set of linkages with green parties because of the necessity of protecting workers' rights, protecting environmental rights, creating more sustainable conditions, pushing for more sustainable investment, does not necessarily play into the classic sort of corporate definition and original American definition of globalization. So there are conflicting trends of this movement. A couple of phenomena happened, particularly created the rift between the American version and the Chinese version. We have to remember that and so many of us here have taught for years, outstanding Chinese students, have had Chinese students in our universities, have dealt with Chinese students, with scholars, with academics. And we may remember, and I certainly do, from roughly the 2005 period, or roughly even before 2004, 2005, to 2008 or 9, the students came and they in fact wanted to become knowledgeable of how Western and mature economies had developed, what was the evolution, what were the processes, and what were the intellectual concepts that they could then hopefully apply. And it wasn't a question of Americanizing their own society, but it was a question of seeing what was successful. And they looked at the American model, the market-driven model, even the high-risk, high-yield model, the overall, yes, the concept of the shareholder much more versus the stakeholder, the independence required of banks and particularly the financial sector. They looked at all of this as having potential of applicability and potential of helping China move quickly forward. But then along came 2008. Along came 2008, and we have to think of 2008, all of us who've lived through it, who've dealt with it, who've studied, lectured or been directly involved and comfortable and knowledgeable of Wall Street. What happened was much deeper than a financial shock. Because what happened was also a kind of break in this overall general confidence in the American model. Because basically what 2008 proved was that totally market-driven, profit-driven, high-yield, high-risk, shareholder-centric type of financial structures were extremely fragile. The reality proved that by going under, and which had been the case for a number of years, very weak oversight, very weak accountability. Remember that the system was not under Basel III, which is very stringent, but under Basel II, which was very lax, and which basically pulled self-regulation standards and allowed that for banks on a global level. This model seemed to work till it didn't. And when it didn't, as you all know, when Lehman collapsed, when Almost City collapsed, when the US government had to fully step in for the very first time with direct intervention, both the US and the UK and its banks, this in a sense was a very severe sort of cultural shock for Asian countries. Because in a sense, as they looked at their own model, heavily state-owned or state-influenced, at a much less competitive, but much more, in a sense, everyone on the same page in terms of commercial, financial, trade, political philosophy, which was, in a sense, more constrictive. They were aware of that. But what, in fact, 2008 seemed to say, wait a minute, Our model is now vindicated. We have barely been affected by the crisis of 2000, which is true. Asian countries were minimally affected. Asian banks had not gotten involved in Asian financial institution, US mortgage-based instruments. Everyone had not jumped onto the consolidation, mergers, acquisition, expansion wagon because it wasn't even an option. It wasn't there. And so these institutions, despite serious problems, there's no question, including shadow banking, including lack of a solid regulatory, transparent regulatory structures, et cetera. But overall, it seemed that the state still had a very important role to play. It was a positive role. And lo and behold, when the US and the EU, the largest bank, financial, corporate, industrial markets, got into trouble, they had to turn back to their governments. And so, in a sense, this broke the mold. And this is very important because China at that time was moving rapidly in terms of economic growth, development, urbanization, reduction of poverty, but it was still heavily, as I said, state-owned, which it became much more after Xi came to power in 2012. But the point is the system in 2008 to 2009, all of a sudden began to look much more resilient. Now, what has often been misunderstood is that a totally market-based free market system also allows for a lot more adaptability and flexibility. So yes, the banks almost went under. The economic system was deeply affected. We then, within a few years in the European Union, went into the sovereign debt crisis, which was a horrific blow and impact to economies across all of Europe. But the reality was that governments in sync with the private sector was able to show a remarkable level of flexibility, of basically fairly rapidly, first of all, imposing much stricter regulation. Yes, this regulation was accepted, including, of course, as we know, the stress tests, including creating, again, a whole series of firewalls, of divesting, of reducing and limiting the impact of bad assets, of loan loss provisions, et cetera, et cetera. But what all this meant was that when absolutely necessary, governments could come in and do what they had to do, which was in large part to guarantee all liabilities. Central banks took a much more aggressive and much more, in a sense, adaptable role by increasing the scope and increasing the expanse of its possibility of what it could do under its mandate. We're all familiar with Mario Draghi's wonderful phrase of July 2012, we'll do whatever it takes. But the whatever it takes was a fascinating phrase because it was whatever it takes under the mandate. And the mandates of these central banks, interestingly enough, were flexible enough. We've seen this again in 2020. So what the Western, if we can call it this, the US, EU, UK model proved, because it had gone through many other major crises, economic, financial, geopolitical, that it had the resilience to adapt, to very often become far to lesser their importance, to cut enormously overhead, to change, excuse me, their strategic goals, to bring about new policies, but fundamentally to meet the worst of the challenges and to move ahead. That's a very complex issue. And the real question down the road is, will the Chinese model, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in a minute, will this model be able to absorb within its extremely stringent guidelines and perimeters that kind of flexibility and adaptability? That we don't yet know. But what did happen was that we began to look at a much more, if not antagonistic, but certainly a much more rival-based and rivalry-based kind of system and relationship between Asian economies where China wanted to be the lead player, the US, the EU model. Now, one thing which, as I mentioned, unfortunately, the pandemic hit at a time where the US, which with the EU had always functioned in a sense as one broader geostrategic, geopolitical, and in many ways geoeconomic bloc, was actually in a much more, not necessarily fragmented, but I would say sort of uneasy relationship, in part caused by rather odd decisions, not only to declare the so-called trade war on China, but also sort of mini little trade wars by suddenly dumping tariffs on Europe, by dumping tariffs on Canada, by tariffs. In other words, these tariff issues, which were not in and of themselves that dramatic, but which created a sense of a sharp difference of approach and of opinion, and a very sharp, almost difference of philosophy as to how the US was relating to these other countries. This was a problem. Why? Because it was a question of the US setting, in a way too heavily sometimes, or with too strong a hand, its own criteria and standards. But all of this was still based on the fundamental balance of power established through the US, through Europe, through the UK, from post-World War II order. This was still the tradition moving out of Bretton Woods. I mean, we have to remember that when suddenly we're accusing and blaming and looking to remove ourselves, or one way or the other, from all of these multilateral institutions, these are not only separate institutions, but they are part of a broader system of basic pillars of stability. And the significant thing that I always sort of, and I certainly remind my students always, that within a period of 5 years, 1944 to 1949, all huge multilateral institutions we are still right now living with, living under, and trying to redefine, were set out, were founded. If we think of the IMF, the World Bank, the UN, NATO, the OECD, the GATT, 1947, which then morphs eventually into the WTO, these structures, that's when they were set out. And they were set out, which is interesting today in 2020, they were set out to bring stability and to bring a sense of order to a completely devastated global environment. Europe didn't exist, literally. It's total devastation. So if right now we are looking at horrific human toll, horrific tragedy, potential huge loss of economic growth, of development, of even the very possibility of economic activity, which is worse, this is not as severe, of course not, but it's very close in the sense that we now again need these institutions. And the one institution that has certainly come up to par and has shown itself extraordinarily flexible and able to step right in has been the IMF. I mean, if we just think, the IMF that had to step into Europe in the sovereign debt crises, the IMF that immediately in March not only made it clear that it was going to be a very active player, but let's step out of the large global economies. The IMF immediately granted, between March and April, debt forgiveness to over 95 of the poorest countries. This is an extraordinary step. Because when we talk about globalization, when we talk about the tariff wars, when we talk about all of these issues, we talk about the main players. But the main players, that's exactly what they are. They're the main players. And then the question is, what are the ramifications for all the other countries? What are the ramifications for all the other degrees of development that emerging markets are functioning under? From those that are about to get to a level roughly in sync with, to those who are bare, and to the very, very poorest in sub-Saharan Africa. And this is where the IMF did step in. So we needed the IMF to step in. The other thing that the Bretton Woods Agreement set out in many ways through the rules and mandate of the IMF was to set out much greater role and flexibility for central banks and the ability of central banks to be the currency stabilizers. Because I just want to bring out one important point, what has happened in terms of this pandemic, and the couple of positives, they're not many, but the ones that are there are very important. We have to remember that despite everything that's happened since March 2020, we have not had currency crises. We have basically managed to maintain, thanks to central bank policies and central bank coordination, which was one of the main pillars of the concept of Bretton Woods and the IMF. Out of coordination and policy, we have managed to retain roughly the same dollar-euro parity. We have roughly the same dollar-euro-yen, in other words, the major currency parity. The sterling has suffered, but still within a range that's viable. Okay? We also have to remember central bank reserves. Global central bank reserves, since 1999, when the euro was set out, have basically remained within the same alignment of 65% in dollar, roughly 27% euro, and then the other currencies. Yes, definitely we have sterling, we have the Swiss franc, we have the yen. Since 2014, the yuan has come on with a very thin tranche, being part of the standard drawing rights. But basically Canadian dollar, so this has not changed. This has certainly not collapsed. We have not had any major bank failures. This is enormously important because this isn't a question of just the health of the banks, the health of the institutions. What is so interesting is these are the institutions that we're now completely dependent on to start lending to small and medium businesses and to start the first steps of rebuilding an economy. Because if you do not have healthy banks, your banks do not have the sufficient resources to provide very solid and very stable lending procedures. Remember that every one of the major the 30 global systematically important banks, all of them have had to set aside massive loan loss provisions. That has been a given, and it's happened very quickly. These banks have set it aside. They're prepared to take large losses, but because of all of the reforms, because of all of the demands imposed by Basel III, the capital adequacy requirements, because of the constant stress tests, one of the most impressive things was in April of 2020, Jerome Powell of the Fed insisted on stress tests because he felt it was urgent to know in the immediacy what could or could not happen and where the weak points were. This is extraordinarily important. So with that, we basically kept the foundation basically solid. The other thing that did not happen, despite the fact that, remember, for 3 months the world stopped. It was all over. Yet despite that, what is so interesting is we did not see any hyperinflation crisis, and we did not see a sharp spike in inflation, even in weaker markets. Again, based on policy and coordination of central banks. So these are hugely significant issues, which show that, first of all, the world did learn its lessons of 2008 to 2009. That's number one. Number two, what it also proved again, which in a way means that neither the US system nor the Chinese system is completely right, because in order to make it work, you need to have the private and the public sectors work in coordination. So you had to have this sort of almost built-in automatic cooperation. The first thing that had to happen with the banks, the central banks and treasuries had to come in. And you may remember that in March of 2020, the Federal Reserve immediately came out with a 1.5 close to Federal Reserve and Treasury trillion. The ECB immediately put out a 750 billion rescue package. And now we are just at the cusp, and this is in a way horrific, because just as we're in the process of going through a second surge, the tragedy is far, far from over. We still don't know how deep the damage will be, particularly across the board of all business sectors, small and medium enterprises, overall the economy on the ground, not theoretical, but on the ground. We have the US Congress that cannot get its act together for 5 months in order to pass a stimulus package that's viable. This is nonsense. And tragically, in the European Union, we had for the very first time a unified, very different type of almost mutualization of debt type of package, which is going to offer grants to all countries, but it did include a rule of law and human rights law, which Hungary and Poland have been trying to totally veto, and therefore this right now has created a stalemate. This is completely outrageous. And tragically, just as in March and April, the world was able to set politics aside, right now it looks like it's not. So we just have to hope that within the next few weeks, either driven by tragedy, driven by necessity, or perhaps driven by reason, but we very much doubt that'll be it, they can come out with a solution. Okay. The other thing that building on that, and I just want to talk a little bit about, under these conditions and under the history, the structure of what we've seen, where are we now and what has to be done urgently in the sense of finding a way to continue moving countries and economies to closer cooperation, coordination, to benefiting from this term of globalization versus still looking out for the interests of all of the segments of its population. Some of these things fall more into the general sphere, because the first thing that has to be done is that there has to be a redefinition, a strengthening, and in a sense, an involvement in the WTO. The WTO, in many ways, has still kept its original functions, but in many ways, it is right now on the cusp of becoming a very necessary partner in helping to push forth and to resolve some of these problems that are creating snags and glitches within this need for cooperation. There's no need. I mean, just to give you a very small example, because the US under Trump was pushing tariffs on Europe, they forgot that when you push tariffs on one country, they will retaliate. And therefore the EU just won a major case in the major ruling in the WTO, which allows it to put $4 billion of tariffs on US goods in retaliation for Boeing subsidies. Now, in the best of all possible worlds, will we even pay attention? No. Right now, this is a problem we don't need. Nobody needs. So how do you resolve this? So this year, there's going to have to be a new director of the WTO. There's going to have to be a new set of criteria. But most important, what's going to happen is a decision-making process of who will be setting out the rules, the standards, and the criteria moving forward. And this is an issue where China is not on the same page. And so we now have a very interesting sort of dilemma. Are we going to enter a future where, in a sense, we have bipolar system of the US, EU, and China? Two systems, two set of rules, criteria, and regulations. We don't know. It's important to also remember one other thing when we talk about global trade and the importance of trade and why this has to work in sync. The largest trading bloc globally is still the US and the EU. The US and the EU, the numbers in 2019 are 720 billion. The US and China, the numbers in 2019 are 418 billion. Now those numbers are huge. It's a massive growth for China, but it is still the US and the EU. If we're looking at what is roughly the percentage of global GDP, 64, the same thing. The EU is being 16. The UK, if you add back onto it, 18. So it's together, actually, the US and the EU are still close to 40% of global GDP. Now, what has been the response to China? And this is where the US has made a mistake. The response to China was not only to create large trading, not so much accords, but interdependencies. And the concept of interdependency starts all the way back in 2014, when China starting its Belt and Road Initiative, which, as we know, did not work anywhere as well as they thought for a whole number of reasons, and now has been replaced by, in a way, a far more complex but far more likely successful and dangerous initiative, which is the Digital Silk Road. And the Digital Silk Road could, in fact, be much more pervasive. But what happened in 2014? China funded the original structure of the new basic multilateral, which is the Asian Investment and Infrastructure Bank. Country upon country joined. Guess who didn't? This was under Obama, the US. Then we get to the TPP. Now, the TPP had problems, as I said, in the campaign of 2016. Both sides hated it. Okay, I can tell you that, but for whatever reason. But it was also supposed to work in part as a bulwark of the US and Japan and other parts of Asia in relation to China with a larger sense of trading aims, goals, etc. As we know, was thrown out, and that's kind of dead. What now has just occurred, as we know, is that China has just signed on to a brand new agreement. And forgive me, I had it right here. And it was just a week ago, and it's a massive, huge trade agreement, which basically, give me just 1 second, because I'll send it to you, okay. It was a trade agreement which basically between China, it was economic cooperation. It was an economic cooperation partnership between China, Japan, Korea, Singapore, 15 countries in Asia. So, but China's taking the lead of it. The US has nothing to do with this. So in that sense, are we seeing China putting other countries around Asia in a complex situation of being more China-centric, which makes perfect sense from the geographic, geopolitical, geostrategic perspective? But the issue is, what is the response in Europe? And what is the response in the US? And I just want to talk for a minute about Europe, because in many ways, we sometimes forget that we have, as I said, 3 pillars, not 2. And Europe is a very, very important player. It is not a crucial, at this point, military or geopolitical player necessarily, but it's a geostrategic player. Because when we look at the broad definition of what is NATO, NATO basically incorporates the countries of Europe, the countries of the US, a broader definition. We have to remember, Greece is in NATO, but so is Turkey. Right? When we begin to look at the, as I mentioned, the broader role of the global economy and currency markets, there's still 2 currencies that are leading it. Dollar, all commodities are still dollar denominated. And then there's the euro, which has a huge economic clout and weight. Same thing in terms of the banks. In terms of the global banks, of the 30 banks, it is important to still remember that basically 13 are out of Europe, which means both the EU, the UK, Switzerland. We then have roughly 10 North America. We then have 4 Chinese, 3 Japanese, etc. But the positioning, therefore, and the ability of Europe and the European Union, which has shown in times of emergency that is perfectly able to work much more in sync than often assumed, is actually essential, in part as a buffer, just as the role that it played for 50 years during the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union, but today, if necessary, in a purely economic sphere, between the US and between a much more China-centric Asia. Europe still has a major role to play. The question is Turkey. The question is Russia. The question is policies and philosophies that then move both south and east. So we're now at a time where decisions are going to have to be made. Decisions that, as I said, have tragically been exacerbated and often horrifically both underestimated and underappreciated under COVID. And what I mean by this is the following. And I just want to mention two things. One is an article that came out by Julian Tett just a few days ago in the Financial Times called Globalization's Death Has Been Exaggerated. As we can see, and as I've tried to present, that is indeed the case. We cannot decouple. We cannot return to isolated home markets. For a short period of time, this was a real discussion. Remember that, April, May, June. But it can't be. And the fascinating thing is that we have these tiny green shoots of recovery because actual global trade has picked up again. Because one thing is technology. And I just want to stress this, both pro and con, because this is one of the biggest challenges we're facing. In a very odd way, when this arrived, when COVID struck us, we were in the most bizarre situation. We were so proud and sure of our modernity, our knowledge, our science, our ability to deal with the outside world. And nature and the pandemic laughed at us. In many ways, and my good Italian friends know so well, we returned to the exact same information we had in 1347 when the Black Plague, when the Black Death landed in Messina. We were not that far from it. Remember, we talk about quarantine. What is quarantine? Quarantine were the 40 days, la quarantaine, were the 40 days of imposed quarantine since the 1300s. That's what it was. We had no knowledge, nothing. But on the other hand, we had this absolutely extraordinary ability to suddenly work, function, teach, learn, communicate, just like we're doing through technology. So we had the very, very ultimate of advancement and modernity. And in reality, we were totally helpless. And I think in many ways, this has created an entire different set of traumas that we don't even understand fully. Because as we were so dependent on technology, it also meant two things in terms of globalization, was that misinformation could spread at an amazing and dangerous rate. We were much more at the mercy of rumor. We were much more at the mercy of anyone able to propagate whatever they wanted to through these mediums. But the other thing, which is in fact even more important, is how many people around the world could not benefit fully from this technology. How many people in the most advanced countries do not have 24/7 broadband? How many children around the world will have missed almost 2 full years of education because they don't have necessarily the ebooks and the Zoom and the instruments and the tech, et cetera, et cetera. They don't have it. So we really have to think about where do governments look at what has happened and what does it mean to have democratization in the sense of democratization of basic services to allow all members of society to participate, not just in nonsense that something is picked up here and there, but in actually something that can be useful and helpful. This is a tremendous challenge that we're going to have. The other challenge is, and this goes back to the trade issues, lack of transparency, lack of cooperation. Whatever we think about the beginning or how this virus came to us, what we do know is that there were at least 2 months in which we did not have sufficient information and in which we did not have enough open channels of information that we were provided with. Were the responses completely different? Yes, Did Europe in many ways bring about a much more coordinated and much more successful set of responses? Absolutely. The US was horrifically fragmented. Were they able to pour in a massive amount of money for therapies and now for the vaccine? Absolutely. But in the meantime, it was completely ineffective, it was fragmented, and it was torn by outside factors rather than focusing on the tragedy at hand. We think, as we now look at China, that they have come out of it and are moving very much forward. But again, we are functioning with limited information. And as so many of us know, the information often is, in the last year, more and more limited. So all of these factors are out there. We are in a period of complete disruption. Globalization is not over, because it can't be, because we are right now in a world with all the factors I've mentioned, that we are interdependent and we're interconnected. And considering how tightly interconnected and interdependent we are, we have to find some way to make this work, because we cannot totally separate. But right now, unfortunately, we're having a lot of problems are really coming together on the same page. Again, looks like the European Union may be a little bit more quietly, more low profile, but there still is potentially more hope. And the real issue is, this is not the last of the crises. What happens the next time when it's not a pandemic, but it's a massive famine, it's a flood, it's a drought, it's some other atrocious natural phenomenon that creates one more time the requirement for lockdown, the risk of economic failure? Are we ready? Those are some of the challenges. And that's why, as we look at redefining globalization, we have to take all of these elements into play, and we have to realize it's there. The question is, where do we go from here? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Irene. I'm very happy that I am the first one to be able to talk and maybe summarize what I got actually from your amazing talk. And what I'm going to ask is for the other people in the room to prepare their questions. I mean, we have 8 minutes, so it's going to go fast. But thank you so much. I mean, it was very rich. And so my understanding, and you did a 3-part presentation. So the first part was about what's new with this globalization. And I think, to tell you the truth, I mean, you brought ideas and concepts that honestly, I didn't think about it. So I've learned actually from this presentation a lot. So what's new compared to the past model of globalization? So the 3-pillar aspect, I think the way you defined it, I mean, really made a difference in my understanding of what's new nowadays. Before your talk, I would have said nothing is new. I mean, it's the same old story and so on. But now I know, I understand why you're talking about redefining globalization. The second part is, why is it important to look at globalization this way? I mean, with the 3-pillar perspective. And I think you made a very strong case for that. And the third part was what has to be done. And it's very interesting to me because you sounded very optimistic at the beginning of this third part, telling us that in fact there was a balance that was found, or that was starting to be found, between China, Europe, the US, the international organizations. So these 4, so 3-pillar plus the international level. So I was optimistic for a couple of minutes, but then you came back to, yeah, but we have challenges ahead, and pandemic is actually a result, but also a new way of understanding our weaknesses and the roadblocks. And you pointed out to WTO, for instance. I mean, so we have different roadblocks in front of us. So yes, so that's my understanding, what I got from your talk, and I am different now compared to an hour ago. But I would love to, yeah, so I see Afzal has a question. So Afzal, maybe if you want to jump in.
Yes, please. I'm sorry, I think you're muted. The gentleman is muted.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yeah, now I can hear you.
And the sound level is reasonable?
It's okay, not great.
So they have a name for it, but let me describe.
Now I can hear you, please.
The Israel, UAE, Bahrain, and lately also Sudan, and some effort with Saudi Arabia, as well as I understand that there are other countries that could be joining. And also there probably is a very strong reason behind that, looking at the momentum of it. And there is a trade component in those agreements. So if you have, is that on your radar? And if you have any comment, any insight, would love to hear that.
Thank you. Unfortunately, I would have loved to be able to talk for another hour, and you're absolutely right, because this is another dimension that hopefully is a very positive dimension moving into the Southern Hemisphere, because we're basically seeing the potential of much closer links, certainly with Israel, with potentially Morocco, in other words, with more North Africa, and then moving on into Africa and actually into the Arab countries. So this is quite unique. What is interesting is this is in large part, and in a purely realistic economic basis, brought about by the lesser reliance on oil, by the fact that oil prices are dropping, by the fact that countries that could simply function with totally non-diversified economies, which were totally oil and gas dependent, really can't long term. And we know, certainly the case with Saudi Arabia and other countries, they are already at times having to go into their reserves, their monetary reserves. So this has certainly been an incentive. This has been around for a few years and now has come in a sense to a head. This is certainly one very positive thing that the Trump administration has brought about. What is very difficult is, however, that once we get into that part of the world, we tragically also enter into the most complex and the most painful political dimension. We enter into a historical dimension. The question is, interestingly enough, will the economic dimension supersede the historical and cultural dimension? I very much don't see how, and maybe I'm wrong, how they can somehow find some symbiosis that would be ideal. I don't know if it's possible. But the economic demands on these countries, particularly again post-COVID, considering the damage, considering the necessity to have access to the best medical care, medical facilities and technology and nanotechnology, that may continue to push a broader. The other issue is, as you know, there are huge gas fields that have now been discovered in the Mediterranean in relation between Greece, between Israel, between, in other words, all of these countries. So that puts one other dimension out there. So it's a question of energy, and it's a question of pure economic rationale. And that may be it.
Thank you. Just one small subsequent question related. When these kind of new initiatives are taken, one thing that we try to see carefully, if it is conflicting with the existing global systems that are in place, do you see such conflict at all, or it is just an initiative that go very well with the existing system and nothing to worry about?
I'm not, forgive me, I'm not sure what kind of conflict you're referring to.
No, it could be when a group of people are trying to form another group. It's definitely the trade itself, it's like, for example, the WTO system. Some group might say that it conflicts with the existing free, because this will be a new group, definitely. And hopefully it will expand and it will be open to the rest of the world also. But let's.
Oh, I see. I'm sorry. No, I think what is very interesting about these new connections that are now taking place in that part of the world is that everyone is being extremely careful about not calling it yet an accord or an agreement or a regional agreement. And in a way, semantics have to be very much put into play here. Sometimes it depends how you name things. And this is relatively less explosive, if we can use that, than to suddenly declare that they are functioning as much more of a unified group. I don't think neither the countries nor right now the world is quite ready for that. A lot of that, we have to remember, often occurs way beneath the surface and certainly beneath media scrutiny, and that's excellent. But everyone is right now going to have to return, and this is very important in this new administration, and this is one very positive thing. We're returning to protocol, we're going to return to diplomacy, we're going to return to actually functioning within much more bureaucratic and much slower norms, but probably much healthier ways of moving forward. That's what I have a feeling that's what it's going to be.
So we'll take maybe one more question.
Please.
Can I,
Please.
Thierry?
Yes. Please go,
Yes.
go ahead.
Irene, that was wonderful. That was so fascinating. Thank you so much. It was so broad, so rich. So what I just, we don't have much time. So I really get the main, one of the main points, one of the points that you made is this difference between the American, the European, the Chinese bloc. So it looks like Europe is sort of right middle in between, right? Between the two extremes, the two differences, and the hope that cooperation and transparency and democracy will be prevailing and will be spreading across the two. However, I just, I have many points, and maybe I'll send you an email and then ask questions and comment. But unfortunately, really the end was really is disappointing. I think you agree, and this is what you said in a way. So what is disappointing and what is not giving us hope for the future is that this experience, this pandemic showed that at the world level, we have gone separated. There has been no cooperation. Each part has been its own. China has applied its own method. Apparently they've defeated, as you said, who knows, maybe, the data are not so, I have contacts there and it really looks like they're defeated. I mean, apart from the fact that transparency might not appear as so clear. And Europe has done its own way, America has done its own way, the world has. So I think the message, maybe as Thierry was also saying, there was some hope, but then in the end, so the final message might be, this is really, when there will be something else, is this the pattern? Is this what we're going to do? It's just, taking our own direction separated without cooperation. That's very disappointing. After United Nations, as you said, after the war and, what we should have learned. But thank you so much.
Well, I just want to add one very slight positive note. We have to remember that after the financial crisis, when everything was really a complete mess and it slowly came back and growth came back, there was a real concern at the time whether anyone learned any lessons. And there was a real concern whether we had gotten, anything out of this with all this regulatory reform and all of these different measures, whether we were able to move forward. Interestingly enough, 2020 proved that we did learn lessons. And that, to me, is something positive. So maybe, although we are not aware of it now, we still see ourselves in this terribly disparate and, in a sense, often almost adversarial environment. We may actually have absorbed on the government level and the institutional level some lessons that are applicable and we will be able to apply. That's my one hope, and that's why I stressed that
good. Thank you.
The foundations are, in a sense, are here. They're fine. They didn't fail us. And so many of them were seriously reinforced after the 2008 crisis. So hopefully we've learned a few lessons. I'm happy to take more questions, but that's up to you, Thierry.
Well,
a minute can be allowed.
Afzal?
One of the article published about 2 months ago by our Mike Pompeo was about WTO, and he commented out the actual conflict resolution or dispute resolution segment of it that pertains to WTO. And he said our policy is trying to fix that. Number one, if that doesn't work, we'll go for a parallel system or a newer system. I'm asking about this parallel or newer system. Let's say the WTO reform does not go well. What is so wrong about the parallel system or a newer system that Mike Pompeo pointed out?
I'm not familiar, forgive me, I'm not familiar with the article, which I will look up. I think, you know, what is so fascinating, it's almost we have a sense right now everything is on the table. The most important thing is we have to get the WTO to be viable and functioning again. We also do need to get the US much, much more involved one more time in all of these organizations. You may remember the US walked away from the climate accord. It walked away from TPP. It walked away from the WHO. It walked away from everything. It was almost forced to remain in NATO by a thread, okay? So this is something that President-elect Biden has made clear. The US has to become completely involved. There has to be a sense of real arbitrators in place. There has to be a sense that we're back at the negotiating table. And one thing in all of these systems and accords that does trouble me, as I mentioned, when the US is not, and this is not only this administration, it goes back to the Obama years, when the US is not at the table, then it is very hard for it to declare that it has a voice. So this is going to be one of the most important things. We have to remember, Basel II, the US didn't sign on to. Basel III, they did. That big step forward. So presumably they'll do it on Basel IV. And on every one of these, this is the issue. You have to be involved. That at this point, we don't know. What are the systems? Where do we go from here? I don't know. That I don't. I wouldn't dare to answer at this point.
Well, I would like to thank you all for attending this talk, and I would like to thank you even more, actually, Irene, for delivering a wonderful talk. Very enlightening, very inspiring. So I've learned so much, actually. I'm very happy, and it's precisely what we want to create with this community and the monthly seminar. I mean, we want to have these exchanges and we want to learn from each other. So I think it's a check, definitely a check for today. So next talk will be by Pompeo here. So talking about the target zone theory revival. So I'm looking forward to it.